Hello everybody, welcome to this brand new alter tutorial video for Magic the Gathering card. Today we are going to be painting this forest, and we're going to jump straight into it, starting off with a little bit of sandpaper, and we're just going to sand down all the sides of this card that we're going to be painting on. It's been a little bit quiet on the Magic side of things of the YouTube channel. I've been working on music a lot lately. And so this is the first alter tutorial video in a long time. But in case you missed it, I've also been creating content for the Card Market YouTube channel, and I've been painting cards for them. So if you want to see more videos of me painting cards and stuff, you should go over to I'll put a link up. It's on the Card Market channel now. So going all the way back to, I think, maybe September, October last year, 2019. So if you want to see more videos of me painting cards, go there, check it out, subscribe to their channel. It's there's lots of other content on it too. It's good stuff. So this forest, I'm excited for it. It's nice and dark along the edges, which is always a good thing. It's darker cards are, in general, a lot easier to paint and alter than brighter cards, so I picked this one. So starting off, we're mixing up this dark, kind of like a dark greenish color, and I'm just smearing on a little bit of this paint over on the sides of the cards. Doesn't have to be that accurate at the moment. This is just like our base layer, kind of like a base layer, but also a sketch at the same time. I'm kind of thinking about, like, hey, what are these trees on the sides? Where are they going? Where are they growing? And working my way down, kind of thinking about the lay of the land, where this pathway is going to lead to, that you can see in the original art, where the shadow is going to strike, or where the shadow is going to be, where the light's going to hit, those kind of things. But most of all, we just want to cover it all up with dark, except for the top part of the card. We'll save that one to be light and white. But most of this card is going to be pretty dark, so we're just taking this dark color, and we're just smearing on a bit of an indication of a tree right here that's growing through the middle of the card. And we're just putting that on. It doesn't have to be super accurate at the moment. We're just making a mess, and it's fun that way. I like doing cards that are like naturey and wild, because they don't have to be that accurate, you know, like trees go wherever they want to grow, grass grows, whatever, you know, where they decide to grow. It's cool that way. It's easy that way. It doesn't have to be super precise. We're just smearing it on and having fun with it. All the way to the bottom. General rule of thumb, things get darker towards the foreground. So yeah, you can go nuts with it. It can be almost fully black towards the bottom. And this is a very dark art to begin with, and I think by the time we actually get to like the final layer, I'm using pretty much black over on the sides too. So it's yeah, it's a very, very dark kind of art. So sticking with those dark colors, just trying to cover up as much of the border as we can with this first layer. It's going to take a couple layers to make the border fully disappear, but that's okay. So don't be too worried if the paint stays a little bit transparent and you can still see the border on our first or second layer. It's okay. We're going to hit it with a lot of layers, and eventually those borders are going to disappear completely. And all that'll be left will be your paint, your work of art, really. About the brush I'm using, this is a very old brush. It used to be flat, but now it's kind of like hairy and fluffy. Because it's old, and I think I bought it at the dollar store. Like, it's not a very high quality brush. I like to do things kind of DIY and kind of ghetto, and this brush is definitely part of that. But old brushes where the bristles are all kind of like spread apart and fluffy and stuff, they're ideal for painting naturey kind of things, because with those bristles all being spread apart and stuff, it's really easy to give the indication of like leaves and foliage and stuff. So I like using this brush. We'll mostly be using this brush for, I think, like 2/3 of the painting. So after a couple minutes, the first layer would have dried a little bit, and still sticking with the dark color. We're just going over with another layer of that same dark color. I think I added in a little bit more black. And this new layer is going to stick to the old layer, which makes the borders disappear, and covering it all up. You know, acrylic paints are a little bit transparent, so with this second layer we're doing a good job of of making things disappear and covering things up. Here I'm just going to swap brushes real quick to this flat brush. This one's quite new and a little bit higher quality. It's very flat, it's very sharp. And I'm just mixing up a tiny touch of yellow along with this white. And basically what we're looking for is this like subtle yellowish greenish color that's hiding in the background here where the sun's shining through these trees. And we're just dropping in like the sun rays here, making sure that that we put some paint on and we pull away from the card. We're just dropping in our first like light layer, and as you can see, this you know, we put on white, but as it shows on the card, it's not actually fully white just yet. It's going to take a couple layers to cover up the old border, same as with the black. It's just going to take a couple more because lighter colors, they're usually a little bit harder to achieve than darker ones. So here I'm mixing up kind of like this subtle green kind of color, and just with the edge of this brush, making sure that the edge of the brush is kind of chiseled and sharp. I'm just kind of blocking this pathway. I'm just, you know, not too worried about the how accurate the color is at this point. It's a type of green, it's good enough. And I'm just kind of blocking in where all these little things are going to grow and where this pathway is going to lead to. So nothing definitive just yet. We can always cover it up if we don't like it, but I'm just trying to get an idea of what I want to do with this card. And I think it's kind of cool that that pathway is coming towards us and maybe bending off to the left a little bit, and maybe it'll hook back to the right at one point, kind of like curvy and wavy. Now, one thing about this particular card, this particular artwork, the colors are actually really, really vivid. Like those greens in the middle, they're quite hard to achieve sometimes. So I've added in a little bit more yellow here to brighten up that color that we already had. And over on the side here, there's all these roots and things growing on these on this tree, and I'm just kind of thinking about like, hey, let's have our brush a little bit diagonal, as it is kind of like the lines on the card of the original art are already kind of like diagonal, going that way. I'm just kind of trying to mimic that and pull all these little grassy, growy things diagonally from one side to the other, following the original art and the lay of the land, how they depict it, or how it's already pictured on it. And I'm just kind of trying to continue that onwards. So same flat brush, chiseled edge, very or at least quite vivid green colors here. And I'm just dropping in all these little things. Doesn't have to be 100% accurate just yet. Note that these edges of the pathway in the original art, they're a little bit brighter green and a little bit more vivid green than in the middle. So I'm kind of pulling along that way too, where the most bright and vivid greens are on the sides of this pathway. And yeah, just using this this flat brush to drop it in. It's going to take a couple layers. Every time I go back with this brush, I make sure that I mix the color up a little bit, either adding a little bit more yellow, a little bit more blue, a little bit more green, a little bit more white. And just using the very edge of this brush, I'm just dropping in little hints of leaves and growy things here over on the side, just with the corner and the edge of the brush. And definitely making sure that that I'm not like blobbing any paint or anything. It's very subtle touches, especially where these darker walls with the trees and stuff. Definitely don't want to push too hard and make things blobby. We want the leaves to kind of like fall off your brush. And we don't really want to force it, because then you'll blob your paint and it'll just look like a big smudge. Which is cool for some things, but definitely not for painting leaves and stuff. So here I'm mixing up a little bit more of a yellow kind of hue. Going back over to this this same side, following those diagonal lines, chiseled edge of the brush. Thinking about where this pathway is gonna go and where the light's gonna strike. And then once I've gotten rid of most of the paint on the brush, I use whatever's left on it for the sides here, because it would have dulled down a little bit, you know, like there's not that much paint left on the brush. So we can use that for the sides where the light's not really striking, for a couple of subtle like hints of growy things like plants and bush and moss and stuff. Going into some white again. And I'm just using, or kind of like recycling the old color that was already on this brush and just mixing that in with the white to create a very, very faded version of it. And we're going to go back here to the sky in the background and just pulling wherever these this light is shining through. There's a couple of trees here in the background. We'll drop them in later. For now, we're just kind of like aiming to paint the spaces in between the trees. And then whatever's left on this brush, and just dropping in a couple hints of light on this pathway that's continuing on towards us, towards the foreground. Just a couple of light touches. Back into our old fluffy hairy brush. Making sure the water comes off. Into some dark black. Maybe a hint of green in there. And I noticed that I was a little bit too light with the colors here on the side. It's actually like a really dark, almost black on the side of these trees. So going back in, dropping in these shadows with basically just pure black and green mixed together. And especially towards the foreground, we want things to be a very high contrast. As a general rule of thumb, things that are close to you have a very high contrast. And things that are further away, they have a lower contrast. So it's okay to be smudging things up with a lot of dark towards the foreground. And we're using a similar color, just a tiny smidge lighter here over on the side and the back. But yeah, the color that I applied first on these sides, they was a little bit too light. So we're going back in with all of this dark with the fluffy brush, and we're basically holding the brush very vertically. I'm just tapping these things in, and as you tap, those bristles that are already kind of like spread apart because they're old and fluffy, they're going to spread out even more when you hold the brush vertically like this and then tapping it. And that creates the hint of like a texture of all kinds of leaves and bushes and things. So we're just working our way down here. And all of a sudden we've got a little bit of depth in our card, and you can really kind of see this this pathway coming towards us. Looks kind of cool. Mixing in a little bit of blue and black here, and same, still dark color. Same vertical brush taps. Just smudging up this bottom left. Tapping in all these bushes and stuff. And we want that kind of same darkness here over in the top right, where all these dark shadowy bushes are going to grow. You can drop them in wherever, really. Every now and then I need a little bit of a moment to reflect on what I just did. So if there's nothing on screen right now, that's just me contemplating my next move is kind of... So going back into our flat brush, the newer one, the sharper one. Mixing up a bit of yellow, a bit of brown. And basically what we're going to try to do is make a bit of a separation here between what's dirt or sand and what's grass. So we've got this kind of like brown, yellowish hue. And just with these horizontal strokes, chiseled edge of the brush, very sharp. And just pulling from left to right. And with a brush stroke like that, we can create all these little ripples in the dirt, ripples in the sand. Because this pathway is very natural. It's kind of like uneven, but definitely trampled by footsteps and stuff. It's definitely still a path, but it's very uneven. So we want a couple of bits and pieces of this pathway to be very bright and almost yellow. And we want other bits of bits and pieces of this pathway to be a little bit more brown and dark, and maybe even with a touch of blue to make it like a shadowy kind of hue. Especially here on the side, the original art kind of depicts this left side to be in the shade and the right side to be lit up. So we wanted to drop in a couple of darker colors here and there. So adding in a little bit of blue, a little bit of black maybe eventually. And just wherever the original art hints that there's going to be shadow, we stick to that theme. And we drop in a couple of shadows here and there. Same horizontal brush strokes, pulling the paint from left and right. Kind of almost trying to make a gradient out of it where the blue and darker version of this color kind of like fades into the brighter yellow brownish color. And I kind of wanted this pathway to bend left and right, so yeah, dropping in a hint of a sketch of this pathway being pulled over from left and right. And here we went back into like a brighter yellow brownish color to drop a couple highlights here and really solidify this pathway. Really makes it come to life, like straight away. There's depth in it, and it looks kind of real. I'm still doing the same strokes, just these horizontal pulls. Nothing too crazy. Every now and then mix up a slightly different version of that same color. I'm using all kinds of yellows here, mixing with the brown and whatever old color was still on the brush. I'm a big fan of like leaving the old color on the brush and just mixing it in with the new, because that kind of makes your color palette kind of cohesive. You know, it's basically recycling the old hues into the new hues, and that makes everything kind of like stick together. Here I've moved on to a very thin brush. It's probably one of the smallest brushes I have, and I went into some straight black, maybe a tiny touch of brown or blue in it, and I'm using it to kind of define these roots a little bit that are growing on the side here. And this black that I'm using seems to dry a little bit on a lighter hue than what I put on. So right now the contrast is super high, but you'll see that as soon as the paint dries, it mellows out a bit, which is kind of tricky, because that's something especially the cheaper kind of acrylic paints do. You put them on and they look like one color, and then they dry and they look a little bit different. So this is very, very dark, very black, but it'll mellow out as soon as it dries a little bit. Here I'm just doing these very thin, almost kind of like a pen kind of line here and there, where these roots and divots of the trees are all kind of like just being a little bit more in the shade than other parts would be. And just wherever you feel like mixing up kind of diagonal strokes with horizontal and vertical strokes, because we're kind of just trying to follow the lay of the land a little bit here. So depending on what you've been painting before, you kind of have to follow the same angles. You can create all kinds of hints of divots and depth in here with just this very dark color and this very thin brush. It's lots of fun. All these branches and rocks and roots and stuff, they just kind of like appear. Here I'm mixing up this greenish color, green-brown, and it's a little bit darker. I'm just going to try to drop in a couple of hints of these trees that are growing in the back. Obviously there's some very distant ones. They're almost the same light yellow-green color that we had before, but there's also a couple, they're a little bit closer to us, and they're more of this brownish green color. And it took me a couple tries to get that color right, but you know, that's a good thing about painting. If you don't get it the first time, you just paint it straight over it, and then, you know, it's fine. And this is way closer to the color I was aiming for, the color that's on the card. So slowly but surely we're getting there. Adding in another layer. You can really tell that as soon as you cover this top part of the text box, things really start to look as a whole. Makes it kind of come together, you know, blends it in. I like it that way. Still using this very thin brush to drop in all kinds of little details here and there. Still thinking about the lay of the land and wherever these trees are growing. I got a bit of a grayish green color going on right now to put in all these mossy things. And the more you can mix up this color and kind of like go back for another layer, the more your painting is really going to come to life. Here I'm just kind of wiggling this brush left and right, and all these leaves and planty things, they're all just kind of falling off the brush. I'm not really putting in that much effort, or I'm not even thinking too much about it. I'm just letting whatever paint's on the brush, let it roll off, and all these little plant things, they just kind of happen, you know, Bob Ross style. Just they fall off your brush. He'd always say, like, they already live in your brush. You just got to shake them out every now and then. So that's kind of what I'm doing here too. Here we got a little bit of a brighter hue, and same thing as I said before. We're just every now and then, or every time we go in for another layer, mix up the color just a tiny bit. Just playing around with these yellow tones and these more, you know, add a little bit of white in it, and then a little bit more blue and yellow to make a bit more green. And we're just playing around with all these different tones and hues, and the more variation you put into that, the more real it's going to look. Because nature's got a lot of variation to it. Like, not a single leaf is the same color, really. And then the more variation you can bring into your painting, the more real it's going to look. Now this must be like layer number 4 or 5 or something. And every time we go back, it gets more lively and more lively and more lively. So, you know, takes a little bit of effort, but I think you can do this too. I mean, this is a really fun forest to alter, really. It's a good one to go for if you're just starting out. I know the bright hues in the middle, they're a little bit hard to achieve, but with the dark edges and stuff, it's really probably one of the easier forests to go and try and do. And because it's all naturey things, you don't have to be that accurate with it. It's lots of fun. And I made this one in like half an hour, which is pretty quick. Maybe a little bit longer, maybe like 40 minutes. So you can take a little bit longer if you need to. Obviously, there's no rush. Just have fun with it. But it's definitely not impossible. I think everybody can do it with a little bit of practice. And you might need, you know, like the right materials for it. You know, you need a couple of very small brushes. They can be kind of hard to get sometimes. Usually when you go and, you know, you go to the dollar store and you see these packets of like acrylic paint and brushes. The brushes are usually way too big and the paint is usually not that good. So I do recommend going to the, you know, art supply store to pick up smaller brushes and at least student level acrylic paint. It would definitely help a big deal. So still with this very tiny brush, I'm trying to mix up a very vivid green here for the sides of this pathway, and just a tiny bit of highlight on these bushes on the side. Because these greens on the pathway, they're actually very vivid. Greens are kind of hard to match sometimes, hard to mix. Definitely a lot of yellow, a lot of blue involved. Definitely more yellow than blue. But yeah, these are bright. Very, very bright. It might not even really show on camera that much, but these are some very, very bright and vivid greens. Same thing, we're just swirling this brush around, and wherever a little bit of paint falls off, that'll be our leaf, that'll be our plant, that'll be our little bit of moss. Not really putting too much planning into it, just wiggling this brush around. Whatever falls off, falls off. It's kind of fun that way. Very loose. Got a bit of the old color mixed with a little bit of white. Very chiseled brush. This is where we're going into like some fine detail here. Very tiny touches here with this brush now. The more detailed we get, the lighter touch becomes. Just to tap in all these little bits and pieces. It gets smaller, more detailed. So very chiseled, sharp kind of edge on this brush. Very subtle touches to the card. Don't want to overdo it, don't want to smudge it. It would undo all that hard work we did before. A couple of highlights wherever you want them. So a couple of these branches pop out from these trees in the background. So I added in our old color, just a little bit of older dark color that was still lying on the palette. Mix it up, smudge it on. Thinking about where this branch is going to grow from that tree that we painted before. And at the same time, we kind of want to define these a little bit by going back into our lighter yellowy white hue and kind of sharpen those edges of those trees by adding in more space in between. That really sets them apart. Contemplating life at the moment. What am I doing? It's getting to that point where, you know, 80%, 90% is done. It's just little touch-ups here and there now. Going into some white, some of this warm yellow. I wanted to separate these just a little bit more. Get that glowy effect going in the back where the light really shines through, you know. As if the back of the forest is all like sunlit and stuff. Going same as before, like layer after layer. We've kind of neglected this area before. Now it's time to touch it up. It's getting to the point where those trees are really coming together. They're really defined and separated from one another, which is cool. Back into our pathway here. Just a touch of highlight here and there where the sun's poking through. Lights up a bit of this pathway with all its, you know, like little piles of sand and little pebbles and rocks and stuff. So you can make it as detailed as you want it. But think about what lives in that pathway, you know, like, is it just going to be sand? Are there going to be like little bits of stone here and there, or mud, or little plants growing in the pathway? And think about what lives out there. What will make it look real? Making a very bright yellow here for a couple more highlights. Once again, every time we go back for another layer, mix up the color just a smidge. Going lighter and lighter or darker. And every time we go back, we make our touches smaller and smaller. And then you'll see that the detail is just appearing, falling off your brush. Mixing up a bit of a green here. It's very light. It's got a bit of white in there. A bit of yellow, a bit of blue. Back over to our bushes on the right. We must have covered this for, you know, this must be like the 6th time or something. But every time we go in and you mix up your color just a little bit differently and you put a little bit of that paint on, it adds to the depth and it adds to the detail. Make it come alive, you know. Tiny taps with this, still the same small brush. Adding in a little bit of black. Going back in for a little bit of shade here on the side. And I'm adding in a couple of these horizontal strokes again, just to indicate little divots in between this pathway of, you know, like where there's a little bit of change in height of this pathway made by footsteps, kind of like a worn, you know, like a worn kind of path. Going back into some vivid greens now. These are all just little touch-ups. They're all optional. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist sometimes. I could have called it, you know, like finished. But just final touches. A little bit more of that vivid green. Small taps. Whatever falls off, falls off. And that'll be our leaf. That'll be our plant. Or bit of moss. Making this side of the pathway come alive with stuff that's growing on it. Bit of that darker color. Final touches here on the top trees where I just wanted to set a couple of these plants apart. And there's actually a couple of like branches with little leaves on it on the side. So just thought I'd tap that in. Just the very corner of this sharpened, chiseled edge of the brush. Adding a little bit of contrast to these trees in the background too. I think this is where I realize I'm kind of overdoing it. I might have to touch it up and make it a little bit lighter. But I do kind of like the way it's been set apart from the other trees in the background. So this will be about the end. I think we've done a pretty good job painting this one. It was a fun forest to paint. So what I'd like to know before we go is if you enjoyed the clouds in the background, let me know. And what I'd also like to know in the comments is which forest is your favorite forest out of all the forests in Magic. And maybe next time I can paint your favorite. Let me know which forest you like most. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a like. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of these videos. And then we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks so much for watching and have an awesome day.